Hey, welcome back, Faithful Politics listeners and watchers. If you're watching on our YouTube channel, I am your political host, Will Wright, and I'm joined by your faithful host and my friend. I guess he's your friend too, Pastor Josh Bertram. How's it going,
Hello,
Josh?
hello. I'm everyone's friend, Will.
Yes. And this week we have with us Elizabeth Neumann, who served as the Assistant Secretary for Threat Prevention and Security Policy in the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, Office of Strategy, Policy, and Plans. In this role, she oversaw the development and coordination of department-wide policies for screening and vetting terrorism, prevention, counterterrorism, and countering transnational criminal organizations and other persistent and emerging threats. And it's this experience that actually makes her the perfect person to talk about the rise of Christian extremism in this country. So we're going to be talking about that and sort of how she uses her experience to kind of, sort of unpack all the Christian extremism we see in the country, or some see in the country. And she was nice enough to actually even write down all of her thoughts on paper, 321 pages worth, and had them bound and made into a book so you can read for yourself. And the book is called Kingdom of Rage, The Rise of Christian Extremism and the Path Back to Peace. So welcome to the show, Elizabeth.
Hey, thanks for having me, Will and Josh. I am delighted to join a podcast that I've been listening to for the last 3 years.
Man, thank you.
Yeah, like for those that weren't privy to our pre-taping, banter, Josh and I were gushing a little bit because, like, I don't know, like sometimes we do these podcasts where, like, is it just the three of us that are actually going to be listening to this? Like, is there an audience out there? Because, like, you guys need to leave us, like, the star review. Like, if you listen, you hear my kids at the very beginning say, leave my dad a 5-star review. Those are my kids, by the way. So yeah, well, thank you so much, Elizabeth, for being here. So I guess maybe we'll just jump into it. Like, what inspired you to write the book Kingdom of Rage?
So I've been working in the Homeland Security field since 9/11, and I happened to be in Washington, D.C. on 9/11. And it was a very formative moment. I was very young and was working for the George W. Bush administration at the time on domestic policy issues. And as I was driving out of the city that day, 20-minute commute took 6 hours to get home because traffic was so bad. I remember distinctly looking in the rearview mirror and seeing the Capitol and wondering, will I see it there tomorrow? Because there were still planes in the air, and we didn't know what was happening. It was very scary. And I was kind of convicted that I wanted to do whatever I could to support protecting our country and making sure that America never had such a bad day again. And it kind of led me on this trajectory to do Homeland Security policy work. And that's what my career has been, including serving in the Trump administration and working on counterterrorism in the more recent years. And one of the things that was really hard about January 6th was realizing that we had failed. It felt very much like a personal failure. I had failed, that we had spent 20 years, lots of policies, lots of money, lots of training, lots of changes in our bureaucratic systems to protect our country. And while thankfully we have not seen an attack on the size and scale of 9/11, we did see an attack on a major symbol of our country's what we stand for. And it wasn't from Al-Qaeda or ISIS, it was from us. And I think the second part of that day, what was really horrifying, was besides the security failures, and I don't think we talk about that enough, but there were significant security failures on January 6th. The other part that was really hard was not only was it Americans that were doing this, it was people that I identified with, right? These were Christians, these were conservatives, a number of people that have since been arrested and indicted came literally from the county I grew up in Texas. And it was one of those moments where the professional and the personal collided, and I felt compelled to do something. I felt that if we felt so strongly post 9/11 asking the Muslim community to push back against extremists within their religion, shouldn't the Christian community be doing the same? Shouldn't take it out of the faith to just the conservative, the Republican community, shouldn't they be doing the same? Shouldn't that we be pushing anybody that thinks that violence is the answer out? You cannot be a part of the mainstream. And what we've done instead is we've tolerated it, and we've actually welcomed it in strange ways. And now the extremism is in the mainstream. And that's part of the reason I wrote this book, was to sound the alarm. We have a problem, and we need to be so reminded about the problem. I'm very intentionally not trying to fearmonger, but we do have a problem. But there are solutions here. And the reason I wrote this book was there's a lot of diagnoses about the problems that we're facing as a country, and why did this happen? And there are lots of really interesting ways to analyze the problem, but I also wanted to do something about the problem. Like, how do we solve the problem? So it's more than just a diagnosis. It really is a prescription for what we can be doing within our communities to rebuild peaceful civil society.
That's amazing. When you're telling your story about being in DC when 9/11 happened, I grew up outside of DC. So I remember I was a sophomore in high school when that happened, and I was in my chemistry class when I went in and heard everything about it. And they closed the schools, and there's no planes in the sky, and it was so strange. And then hearing that something hit the Pentagon, then I knew people that worked at the Pentagon because that had attended the church that we were at, and it was such a scary moment. So I can definitely relate to that sense of, like, what are we going to do? How are we going to protect this country? And then now this weird tension of wanting so much to protect this country, feeling this deep sense of patriotism. I took it in my own way. For a while, I wanted to go to the CIA. I wanted to go to the military, and then God called me into ministry. And so I didn't do either of those things. But I felt that sense of patriotism, and almost that my own way of wanting to conserve this, conservative tradition and keep this thing going, and then seeing the same kinds of stuff on January 6th, and through the interviews we've had and the ways that we've talked to people, how disturbing it really is. The more you pull the strings on what happened in that day, and how Christian, and symbolism it was, and how disturbing that is, and how disturbing it is that it doesn't disturb other people more. And I really can relate to all that. And I'm very curious, though. You mentioned that there are these security issues on the January 6th. So this is kind of like two sides, like a two-part question. You can answer any of it or however you want. But, working with the Trump administration, thinking about counterterrorism, what was that like, especially as you started to realize, or maybe this was after, right? But you started to realize, hey, there's this Christian nationalism, there's this white Christian nationalism, there's this movement that's very scary, right? That we should be concerned about, and kind of walk us through that January 6th. What were those security issues that were kind of let go or went by the wayside, that put us in such a vulnerable position on that day?
So I was asked to come into the Trump administration 2 times. I said no, and the third time I said yes. And I
he is
said
very
yes.
persistent. We
Yeah.
can give him that.
Well, it was not him. It was somebody else that was recruiting me. But the concern was that we had some significant national security challenges, and they were concerned that there were a number of people coming in that had no previous government experience, no security experience, and it was also difficult to know who you could trust. Operating in the Trump administration was often you hear people describe it as playing 10-dimensional chess. You never quite knew what somebody's motives were, and you were constantly looking for backstabbers, and it was utter chaos. Some of the commentary about Trump's governing style is that he governed by chaos. He liked to pit people against each other. And so that was the dynamic in the White House. And thankfully I didn't have to work there. But it flowed out and impacted the agencies where I was working. So you're operating in this environment where you didn't know who you could trust. And I had a friend who we had worked together in the Bush administration, and she was trying to find people who she could trust, who actually knew something, a little bit about Homeland Security. So that's kind of how I ended up there. And I tend to, sometimes I beat myself up that I feel like I was too naive, but I also view it as just the way God has worked in my life. I tend to give people the benefit of the doubt, and I tend to try to assume the best of people. And it took a few months, but after a while you started to realize that the president was not rising to the occasion. He was not, a lot of people, now that he's been elected, he's going to be different, or he's going to treat this job seriously. And we saw pretty early on that, one, he really didn't like the job. I remember having conversations with my boss, John Kelly. He was the Secretary of Homeland Security at the time, that the president just wasn't happy. He did not like the structure of the work and what he had to do. And, there were conversations of like, maybe he'll resign early, which too bad that didn't happen. But he was really, really not liking how it constrained him in the early days. And likewise, the whole government apparatus was trying to figure out how to serve this particular president. And, after a period of time when you originally assume they just don't know any better, they don't know how it's supposed to work. After a while, you start to realize, they don't care how it's supposed to work. And so you ended up with, security stuff, right? National security stuff. Sometimes the best case scenario was the White House staff, the president would just leave something alone and let the experts in the agencies do their job, and things would be fine. That's, I think, how you end up with many people in the United States who are like, well, things worked pretty well under Trump. Well, you can point to a few policies where, the White House staff didn't get involved, and you had people with previous government experience who were probably ideologically conservative, and they implemented changes in certain spaces. And you, if you're a conservative, are like, oh, look, they did this policy. This was good. It helped my taxes. It helped my small business. You can point to those things and see where maybe you saw a win. The problem was when Trump would engage in something, or his staff would engage in something, which happened a lot at the Department of Homeland Security, that's when the chaos would reign, and when there would be pressure to try to do things that were illegal or unconstitutional. And when you were raising important security concerns, it was incredibly difficult to get people to actually focus on those security concerns and get answers or get decisions on what needed to be done about those security concerns. So the chaos didn't affect all of the agencies quite as much as it did the Department of Homeland Security. But I definitely, by the time you get to the 2018, 2019 part of the administration, the president was a little bit more comfortable in pushing back on the so-called adults in the room. And he would get frustrated when he would get told no, because something was illegal or something was unconstitutional. Some of the classic examples were he wanted to put alligators in moats next to the border wall. He wanted to shoot people, get authorized lethal force from to have Border Patrol standing on the wall to be able to shoot people as they were trying to come in. are, by the way, that's all illegal. So there were,
Holy smokes.
there were like, but he would come up with these ideas, and sometimes you were like, oh, haha, that's funny. And then you're like, oh no, he's serious. Okay, so how are we gonna
The
pivot out of
alligator
this
on the
one?
moat.
Yeah, alligators and moats. Okay, let's come up with the reason why that's not going to work. So that was the environment that we were living in. In particular, tying it back to January 6th, one of the biggest challenges we had was that domestic terrorism was on the rise during his administration. It really started in 2015, if you're tracking based on attacks and plots and deaths. If you're tracking in terms of numbers, I mean, that probably goes numbers of people that are joining a extremist movement. That goes back to more like the 2009 timeframe, largely tied to financial crises, coming out of the military engagements that we had in Afghanistan and Iraq, which of course continued, but usually those two things, financial crises and military engagements, historically we see rises in extremism in a short period after those. So not surprising that the country experienced, growth towards or a radicalization process, moving people towards extremist ideology. The election of the first Black president, Barack Obama, was definitely a trigger as well. So that movement had been growing. And when Trump comes on the scene, he's tapping into that movement in a way, right? He's recognizing, or Steve Bannon, his strategist, was recognizing, like, there's untapped potential here. There's a lot of anger. There's a lot of grievance. We should use it to get elected. And when kind of coinciding with Trump, I'm not saying that Trump is directly responsible, but in 2015, we start to see more attacks. We start to see more plots disrupted, people arrested. We also see a lot more death. And that uptick has been happening ever since 2015. Like, we're still on pace. I haven't seen stats for this year, but last year is expected to continue that upward trend where we have more attacks and deaths coming from domestic violent extremist actors than foreign terrorist organizations or people inspired by foreign terrorist organizations. So that trend line we were starting to pick up in 2017. Charlottesville is one of those, this is different, what's happening? Then we have a Tree of Life synagogue shooting in Pittsburgh, Christchurch, which was in New Zealand. It was a devastating white supremacist attack that shocked the world. But for us, it was like, oh, this isn't just domestic. This ideology is global, which we had kind of known, but we just didn't realize how much it had metastasized. And then, of course, in 2019 in the United States, we had that devastating Walmart attack in El Paso. And those moments for the counterterrorism community were this awakening that we have a pretty significant problem on our hands. And most concerning is we don't have the tools domestically to deal with terrorism in the United States the way we do to deal with foreign terrorism. And it gets a little complicated why some of the reasons are good, constitutional reasons why we don't use military and intelligence on our own people, but nevertheless makes it much, much harder to keep people safe in the United States. And so as we're grappling with that, we're trying to get attention, trying to again, we default to this is how we do government. Okay, we have a new threat. We need the president to explain what this threat is to the American people. We need our national security strategy or a national counterterrorism strategy, both of which are policy documents. We need it to declare that this is part of the threat we're going to go after. Now, that might sound, like, who cares? Who cares what a policy document says? Well, all of the way that the federal government's functions work, budgets and objectives and your resourcing gets tied to that strategy. So we were advocating, we need to update our strategies. We need to address this threat. We need to call it out. We need to tell the American people, we have a problem. We have a white power movement that's very violent in this country. They're increasingly coordinating with overseas terrorist organizations and foreign governments. Like, this is a problem and we need to talk about it. We have a militia problem in our country. We need to talk about that. We were not allowed to talk about it. And that is the thing that really kind of broke for me. Like a lot of what I'd never agreed with Trump's characters or his style. I didn't think he was a good president, but I was willing to serve as long as I could do some good. And we eventually ran into a wall where we were not allowed to explain that there was this threat. And so when I left in 2020, for a variety of reasons, including I was getting pushed out because, again, all the adults in the room were getting pushed out in 2019. And so by the time you get to my level, they're starting to push us out too. The kind of the guardrails had broken off, and you get to that period in 2020 where we have the protests for George Floyd's murder, and you have the president decide that this is the time that he's going to call out domestic terrorism. And it's not the white power movement or the militia movement, it's Antifa. I mean, by that point, I had left at this point, but I was like, my hands are thrown up. Are you kidding me? For
Dodge
years,
that bullet, huh?
I've been trying to get you to talk about domestic terrorism, and now you're talking about domestic terrorism in the concept of an anti-fascist movement. That's not even a group, by the way. Like, it's a movement. It's loosely coordinated. The far left, the funny thing that nobody ever talks about with far left extremists is that, like, inherent in their ideology is they don't like organization and structure. They don't want anybody to be in charge. So if nobody's in charge, it's kind of hard to pull off some complex attacks. I'm not saying they don't do damage. They do, but it's just different. It's different than what we saw at Oklahoma City, right? It's different than an El Paso Walmart shooter. And so to have the president of the United States finally be able to utter the words domestic extremism, but in the regards to the wrong threat, was just mind-blowing to me. And it built this permission structure, which he had been building the whole time, that the far-right movement would hear his dog whistles, and they would see it as like permission to, we can intimidate people and dress up in our military fatigues and carry our automatic rifles around state capitals. And we can intimidate people at the voting polling stations. And, to the point where you have a militia group decide to go and see if they can attack Governor Whitmore. I mean, that there is a tie. He didn't have to tell them precisely what to do, but he gave them kind of this empowerment that, hey, we're taking back the country. You should take back the country the way you think is best. And if it's force, well, let's use force. And that's how you end up to a January 6th. January 6th isn't just about stop the steal election denialism, and it's not just about Trump calling everybody there on January 6th. Yes, he did those things, but you kind of have to take the full picture here. Like, it's a movement that existed before he came along. He tapped into that movement. He empowered that movement throughout his presidency. And we start to see increases in attacks and plots. We see in terrorist manifestos his campaign language. That's what happened in El Paso. And then you move to January 6th, and it's just this culmination that finally is big enough that the world could see. But it certainly didn't start with the moment that 2020 was. It was something that had been building for quite a long time.
That is such an amazing kind of like evolution history of kind of how we got to January 6th and beyond. I mean, like I was sort
very
of
insightful,
a rabid listener, watcher of the January 6th congressional hearings. Actually, like we recorded them in audio and made them available on our podcast feed, so people can, like, if they don't have C-SPAN or whatever, they can just listen on their ride home. Because I just thought it was super important that people had access to this. But so I'm appreciative of your insight about kind of from the counterterrorism side of things. But I'd love to get a little bit of your own personal history, maybe your faith journey, because really, your book is sort of the confluence of these two big parts of your life that are really important to you. So maybe just tell us about kind of like, how did you come to the faith?
I grew up in a Christian home, North Texas, so think Bible Belt, non-denominational, mostly churches. But my parents were very much at the intellectual side of evangelicalism, so in-depth Bible studies and high view of the Word of God being the principal thing that guides our life. And I attended a Christian school growing up. In college, I was a part of Reformed University Fellowship, the PCA college ministry. And then in my adult sphere, I've gone to Southern Baptist churches, more non-denominational Bible type churches, PCA churches, EPC churches. We've moved a lot, so we've ended up in different communities at different times. So I kind of consider myself an evangelical mutt. So I kind of can blend in depending on where we are. But of the conservative theological side of that mostly, I do tend to, I'm decidedly not fundamentalist, and tend to be more of a, especially lately in the last 10 years, been untangling my faith from my politics. So I tend to question things, I wouldn't say I'm deconstructing as much as I'm trying to deconstruct my politics. Maybe that's a better way to put it.
Yeah, that's good.
So much of my conclusions of the way things are supposed to be or what we stand for, it was almost as if, well, Rush Limbaugh said it back in the 1990s when I was, my political identity was being formed, and everybody else was listening to him too. And so what it meant to be a good Christian was to be a good Republican, which is, you should believe what the Heritage Foundation put out or what Rush Limbaugh said that day on the news. And so flash forward 20 years, all of a sudden you're like, why do I believe that this economic policy is the right answer? So I really enjoy talking to people from different perspectives. I mean, I have a policy area of expertise, but there's lots of other policy that I find fascinating, and it's not my area of expertise. And I'm very much enjoying the opportunity to kind of deconstruct what I was thought was the right answer, and what does the evidence show us? What does the Bible tell us? One of the spaces that I've really changed a lot in is in the immigration, and what I would never say I was a hardliner on immigration policy, but I certainly was viewing it strictly through that security lens. And two things happened. One, working in the Trump administration, I actually had responsibility for certain vetting and security requirements for our immigration policy. And so I got to get into the weeds of how we do stuff, and kind of came out of it going, well, gosh, we do that pretty well. I mean, the way that we were talking about it sounded like, we're a sieve, and like bad guys were coming in at, left, right, and center. And like, we gotta shut this down so, we don't have another attack. And I came away going like, oh, actually we're really good. Like, sometimes when you get to see some of the stuff that some of the United States capabilities, you're like, yeah, go Team USA. We put really smart people here. We're like keeping the country safe. Good job. And then you're like, oh, so those talking points are totally bogus. Like, that's just made up. That's just to scare people to get votes. And it kind of put me on this journey of like, what should our approach to immigration be? And then, of course, if you spend any time reading the scripture, you can't help but like run across like, oh yeah, the sojourner. Oh yeah, the stranger. Oh yeah, the foreigner. Like,
Absolutely.
oh gosh, the Lord really holds us accountable for how we're caring for them. And like, which of those value systems, are they in conflict? And I've kind of been working through that. I think it's possible that the government can do its job of protecting its people. And I think that's a good function, one of the primary functions of government. And I also think that I, as an individual, and the church can be welcoming. And I don't think those two are in conflict. So that's an example of one of those spaces where I've been trying to be more diligent about, let's let scripture lead here. and let's lead with the principles of Scripture. And then, to the extent that there's a role that I need to play from a policy standpoint, let's bring the policy options. But those options can't conflict, at least in my view, can't conflict with what Scripture tells us we need to be doing.
That's really insightful. And, I guess I appreciate you saying all this, because you're not alone. Like, I don't know how many people I've spoken to either on the show or just within kind of my friend circle, that have said almost, exactly the same thing you said. It's like, my faith's okay, my politics is okay, but, for me to kind of vote my faith, through the lens of my political party, it's hard, because it's like my political party is dictating what my faith should be, or what I should believe in my faith, and to your point earlier, we hear this a lot kind of in the Christian nationalism space about, in order to be a good American, you have to be a good Christian, or to be a good Christian, you got to be a good American, but so then it's like, so who's deciding like what caliber of Christian, is a good American? And then also what caliber of Christian, will go to heaven? Because like there do tend to be like religious gatekeepers, and most of them kind of seem to occupy the political space, or at least they've got the biggest mics, right? So but I want to get into something that you had brought up earlier, and that's solutions. And maybe I'm getting ahead of myself here, because I also there's some other things I want to ask you about, but like when this rise of Christian nationalism became more ubiquitous, I should say. I mean, it's always been there, but like, I would say it's getting much more media attention probably in the past couple of years than it has in the past 20. And I remember having a conversation with Josh, looking at sort of these trends, reading the PRI reports, and just like, this is getting really bad. And I remember telling Josh that like, this is a problem that really needs to be addressed in the church, because if government gets involved, like nobody's going to win, right? Because you're going to have like armed guards in churches, and I mean, it's just going to get out of control. So I love to kind of get your sense of like, is the solutions, that we should be seeking, and maybe you have sought as a counterterrorism expert, more spiritual base, or the legislative base, or is there something else that we're completely missing?
All of it. All of this. All of
yes.
this.
Okay. Next question.
Yeah, exactly. So in part 2 of the book, I kind of walk us through a number of the solutions that we need to consider, and I, following principles of Scripture, start with ourselves. Take the plank out of our own eye before we try to take the speck out of our brother's. And then talk about what we can do within our churches, and then what we can do within our larger communities. And then some very practical tips based on the latest evidence base of what do you do if you suspect that somebody's radicalizing? How can you help them? How do you know when you need to reach out to law enforcement? In particular, there's some important indicators of risk factors and mobilization indicators in the appendix of the book. But the heart of it really is trying to encourage people of goodwill and faith to both examine themselves and see how we might be participating in some of these cycles that lead some to radicalize, and I'll circle back to what I mean by that in a second. But my heart is that I think, I actually came to this conclusion out of a default. Like, the simplest solution here to our national problem, I don't mean the individual problems that we have, but at a national level, to reduce radicalization would be to somehow change the media structure and social media broadly. If we could somehow, turn off MSNBC and Fox News and OAN and Newsmax and go back to a world in which we have more fact-based news and not constantly trafficking in outrage and fear, then I think we'd be a healthier society. I also think there's never that's never going to happen. There's just no way to break the incentive cycle. Social media, there was a study that I talk about in the book, that they know that the way to get clicks, which means money, is through fear and anger and outrage. So like there is a built-in monetary incentive structure to keep us angry, to keep us in our grievances. So I don't think that we're going to see a macro shift that would somehow upend all of this structure that is designed to keep us angry. Consequently, I think that means we have to start working at the grassroots, and we have to work within our churches, and within it starts with us. Like, what am I doing that's contributing to or participating in a cycle that is leading to devastation in my community? And by devastation, it's everything from fractured relationships, and just an increasing isolation, a lack of feeling like what we do even matters anymore. There's huge trends of nihilism among youth right now, which are very concerning. And so that brokenness that we're experiencing causes more damage than just the terrorist attack, right? A terrorist attack is one example of the bad outcomes where the root cause is usually tied to a broken and fractured community. The fact that we're increasingly isolated, and we increasingly, as a people, are having trouble finding meaning in life. And and
a
if
terrorist attack is just a lagging indicator, right?
Exactly. It's a devastating one. It's like one that we certainly want to stop, but when you move upstream and you try to figure out why was that person motivated to commit this horrific act of violence, and you peel back the layers, the underlying psychosocial needs are also the same underlying psychosocial needs for why people move to drug and alcohol abuse, or why we see other social ills, societal ills. So like it kind of takes me back to solutions here, like who can best diagnose some of those societal ills and what to do about them. I think the church has the answers. Like one of the two key underlying factors behind why people radicalize to extremism are an unmet need of belonging and an unmet need for significance. And I think Jesus gives us those answers. It's like amazing when you look at, here's social science telling us, hey, you want to build protective factors? Address these unmet needs. You want to build resilience, or you want to off-ramp somebody that's already radicalizing? You've got to address those unmet needs. Meanwhile, like 2,000 years ago, Jesus already told us this, right? Like we already know that we are not designed to live alone and in isolation. We already know that a search for significance is like core to how God made us, and that the answer to that is I am a beloved child of God. I am a daughter of the King. That's where I get my significance. I also get my significance in laying down my life for others and loving my neighbor. That is my calling. Now, that is so antithetical to the American dream, right? And part of our challenge is that the American dream has told us the way you get significance, or the way that you find belonging, are all of these false idols and gospels that end up being meaningless and, for many, devastatingly meaningless. So I found myself multiple times when I'm writing in part 2 and trying to connect the dots between here's what the social science data tells us, and here's what the church is seeing and saying and offering, what Jesus has to offer. In some ways it's very simplistic, but it is also indicative of a broader church. And I want to be careful here. There's so many churches that are doing amazing good things and that are living out the way of Jesus. But more broadly, if you just say the American church as a whole, it's sick. We are diseased. We have symptoms of something has gone wrong. And when you try to figure out what has gone wrong, it kind of comes back to we're not actually practicing the way of Jesus. We're not actually allowing ourselves to be formed into disciples. And that to me is where the gap is. That's how we end up with so many believers who have made an idol out of a political candidate, or feel really scared that the country is changing, and that the way that their grandparents lived is not the way that their kids are going to live. And living in that fear instead of turning to the Lord and practicing our faith of trusting that God will provide, and that, suffering is a part of our faith. And it might be hard, but he will still provide for us. Rather than that, they're turning to worldly, human being answers to try to make them feel more certain and secure about their future.
Yeah, before Josh, he has a question, but there's a really good book I've mentioned, I don't know how many times on this show, but like a book by Tremper Longman the third. He wrote a book called The Bible on the Ballot, and it's all about basically like, very current pop culture sort of like things that are happening and sort of like how Christians should respond to it. And then he has a whole chapter in there about Christians believing that, they're being persecuted. And mind you, like, this is a smartest theologian I've ever met. He does Bible translations. I mean, he's just like, he's great. But he talks about like, the Bible's pretty clear that like we're all going to be carrying our cross. Like this isn't going to be an easy ride. Like people that are trying to, like advocate for legislation to make the Christian life that much better, it's very antithetical to what Scripture says. So yeah, I think everything you said just really kind of spoke to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you were doing a great job of making this connection to the evangelical church in America and its sickness. And I would love for you to kind of even dig into that some more in terms of where has the church, like in your research, where do you feel like it has gone wrong? Where do you feel like it has gone bad? And and of course, like there are a lot of churches that do a lot of really good things, right? But we have this for a long time. We've had this large group of people that have been evangelical, yet in so many metrics of righteous living, so many metrics of care and love, they've fallen very much short as a whole. And where has the church gone wrong? And even thinking about it through a church in America, but I know it's beyond America. I know that there is this kind of like I'm a Pentecostal. That's the heritage I have, and we've gone way wrong in a lot of ways in terms of our ties to political power, not just here, but I'm thinking in places in Brazil, articles I've read about places in Africa where prophets come out and they support a candidate, things like that, very much involved in political power. Where have it gone wrong? And thinking about someone like let's say, I don't know, like a 13, 14, 15-year-old white young teenager male in the church, how has the church created a place where they might become radicalized and be susceptible to this kind of ideology and this way of thinking, to the place where they, might show up, God forbid, at the next January 6th?
Okay, so there are a couple of threads to pull on there. One,
Yes.
the 13, 14, 15-year-old, I love that part of the question, because where we can have the most impact right now is on our youth. This is broader than just the church, but we suspect that part of the changes in the increases in attacks and the increases in people moving into extremism are directly tied to social media and the proliferation of access to social media and the internet broadly. So in 2012 is generally accepted the tipping point at which we all had smartphones that allowed us pretty easy access, high-speed internet access to whatever was happening online. If you look at that tipping point when kids are forming their identity, usually around ages 12 to 14, 15, the kids that were in that tipping point, the 2012 period to 2016, that is when we start to see a pretty significant shift in youth engagement with extremism. It's also when we start to see, if you have been following the work of Jonathan Haidt, he has a new book out called The Anxious Generation. It's when we start to see depression and anxiety in girls go up. It's when we start to see kind of that nihilism become really in vogue for boys, kind of an apathy that sets into nothing matters. And all of that seems to be tied to the proliferation of social media use. So there are some other factors, and anytime you're trying to summarize, like, you run the risk of taking something that's fairly complex. Sure. And you're missing some of the nuance. But the first thing I would say to parents and church leaders who engage with youth is, let's not give them cell phones, smartphones, until they're past that identity formation period of their adolescence. So the current recommendation is around age 16. And I know that this is like so countercultural, because if everybody else has, it's a collective action problem. If everybody else has their social media phones, and that's how kids are interacting, then they're going to be left out. It is hard. There are a number of organizations like Wait Till 8th, and there's a couple of other groups that are trying to build some momentum so that parents can join together and agree as a cohort, like, okay, we're not going to give our kids social media until they're 16. So that's like really practical, but I have to tell you, as an extremism person, like, one of the most important things you could do is protect your kids from the messaging that they're going to see. So besides the Jonathan Haidt concerns about your kids' mental health, there is no way you can go online and not be exposed to extremist material now. It is so ubiquitous. If your kids are gaming, they are seeing it. Unless you have it really locked down, and you can lock it down so that they can only play with somebody that you know, and they can't, nobody else can message them. That usually is okay. But if they're playing in any sort of multiplayer game, they are seeing, even if they don't recognize it, they are seeing extremist content. So my first thing for parents and churches is, while you can't do it when they're in college, right? But while they're in your home, you should be having conversations with your kids about the fact that they're people who have these extremist beliefs, that their end goal is violence, and that they are pretty sophisticated in how they recruit people, and give them some examples. And there's some tools I offer in the book to help parents think through this. But the goal is to start a conversation, just like we do with our kids on sex and drugs. We need to be talking to them about the fact that the world has people out there who are bent on violence and want to recruit people to their ideology. And we don't want to scare them, and certainly this needs to be age appropriate. You don't need to have this conversation with your 6-year-old, but you do need to be letting them know that they're going to encounter disturbing material or disturbing ideas, and you want them to come talk to you about it. That's the key. It's not that we can fully protect them, but we do want them to be aware and educated and come talk to us when they run across harmful material. So that's one part that I think is just very practical, and I would love for more churches to, I think it's kind of an interesting entry point into the A broader part of the conversation that we've been having today is because everybody wants to protect their kids. Nobody wants their kid to either get radicalized or have a friend that, is contemplating violence. Like, everybody's worried about the next school shooting. So there are some practical things here that we can do better as a community to keep our kids safe.
I just want to say just one thing, that at the beginning of your comment, I bookmarked it because I plan on just like playing that part to my kids. So my kids are 10 and 10 and 7. I feel like I should know that. No, 10 and 8. Dang it. I get the sense like Josh and my kid play together on Roblox, and I'm not sure if his kid is radicalizing my kid or my kid's radicalizing his kid, but I'm sure they're getting radicalized somehow or another, but like the question about cell phones has come up recently, and we're just like, I don't know, like my wife and I have just been sort of like, uncommitted, but everything you said made perfect sense. And I'm just going to say, hey, don't listen to me. Listen to Elizabeth. Look, here's the video.
My poor kids, they were like, why do you have to do the work that you do? And like, I was like, since they were little, I was like, you will never change my mind on this, so you might as well stop trying. Like, I do think if you hold a firm line with your kids, it is tough. And it is actually more work on the parent that we do it because we're kind of lazy. We don't want to have to like drive them places or call the parent and like, oh, here's how you use a regular phone. Do you know how to use a regular phone? Anyway, but I do think it is actually, there's so much data that's coming out in the last 2 to 3 years. And it's one of those things that like, once you see the data, it's really hard not to be like, oh gosh, like I need to protect my child here. And I think that's a great space for the church to be able to engage parents. Of course, everybody wants to protect their child, and most people are not handing over the phone thinking that they're going to cause their kid harm. They just don't know. They don't know this new data that's come out that tells us we need to be thinking about this differently. There was the other part of your question, Josh, was that what can the church be doing about this conversation more broadly? And I think the answer to that, without it becoming political, is that we should all, as Christians, agree that violence is not an option. And that we start there. And then if there's an opportunity to educate and help people understand how somebody mentally can get to this space where they're starting to contemplate that violence is an option, you can start to then draw connections to, shouldn't we be better at this precursor behavior too? Specifically, the definition I use of extremism is when an in-group perceives a threat to their success or survival by an outgroup, and therefore hostile action is necessary. The first part of that definition, the threat to your success or survival, I would say that's like our politics generally, right? Mm-hmm. Like we are constantly being told that the other side is trying to take away our rights, or they're trying to cancel us. And I'm not trying to make light of the fact that there are some very real policy disagreements that we have in this country, but we frame them in existential terms, and we dehumanize and other the people that hold different beliefs. So that part of the definition is challenging because like it's just kind of the norm of our world now, and I would love for that to shift and change. But that alone, you demonizing the other side in your mind or verbally, that isn't extremism. It becomes extremism when you take that next step of hostile action, and there's a spectrum of hostile action. The lower end is things that are non-criminal, bullying, harassment, intimidation, threats. Now, sometimes some of those things can be criminal, but it's really hard to prosecute. You can sometimes also be held civilly liable for those actions. But generally speaking, the government does not work in that space, right? The government kind of focuses more on things that are tangible, like destruction of property, harm to somebody, like a hate crime, terrorism, and genocide. Those are the other end of the hostile action spectrum. So the government focuses on preventing violence preventing physical harm. What nobody is addressing right now, and I think the church is well suited to address, is that lower end of the hostile action spectrum. We used to not need to address it because it was the norm in civil society that when we're angry with somebody or we disagree with somebody, we don't go threaten them. But we have seen a big shift, especially after COVID, where there is now a permission structure. It's now actually applauded and lauded that if we disagree with the school board, I'm going to walk up to the school board member afterwards and yell at them at their car and threaten them. Or the election security official, or sorry, the election official, not even election security, the county clerk that is responsible for administering your county's elections is getting death threats. Or their children are getting threatened. We've had a pretty significant number, I want to say close to half of election officials have quit because of the death threats and the harassment that they've received. And most of that falls below a criminal scale, or they just can't find the individual, so they can't prosecute. But there's real harm there. There's harm to the individual. It scares them. It scares their family. And now we have the need to run elections, and we don't have experienced people able to run them. So we've actually worsened our election integrity by participating in any sort of threats or harassments against election officials. So that set of norms that we used to call like just polite behavior and what's expected of us when we're adults has kind of gone by the wayside. And it really is important for people of goodwill to stand up and say, no, we're not going to treat each other that way. Like, we wouldn't let our kindergartner get away with that. So why are we comfortable with, somebody we love behaving in a way that's childish, but also can cause real damage to people? So I think one of the things the church could do is go back to the teachings of Jesus. I mean, the fruit of the Spirit, if we could just focus on the fruit of the Spirit, gentleness, or the Sermon on the Mount, and the fact that we are to turn the other cheek. Like, the way of Jesus is one of extreme patience and loving kindness and giving people the benefit of the doubt. That none of that is being exhibited in our society now. And to be clear, exhibiting those fruit comes from the Spirit. It is not easy. It is counter to our human nature to turn the other cheek. It's not just a performance here that we're looking for. It's when we are fully formed disciples, when we truly believe that when Jesus says, turn the other cheek, he actually meant turn the other cheek, then we start living that out, and we start offering a counterexample to the way that the rest of the world is behaving. But I do think there's also a time and a place for us to voice and push back against those extremist tendencies. I understand you're upset right now. We're not going to go yell and threaten the school board or the person that you disagree with. There is a role for people of goodwill to stand in the gap and de-escalate things. And I am hoping that through this book and by raising awareness to people that we do have this problem, that people of goodwill will get engaged in their community and stand in that gap and start reestablishing norms of how we treat each other with kindness and patience and gentleness. And by doing that, it starts to de-escalate and reduces the number of people who could become susceptible to radicalization. It does not solve the whole problem, but as I describe in the book, we have an insurmountable number of people who are cognitively open to the idea that violence is necessary to achieve their political aim. It's something like 30 to 40% of adults in America.
Yeah.
I mean, it is mind-boggling numbers. We do not have enough law enforcement in this country to protect that. First, you can't predict which one is actually going to go do something. But that is the space that we're operating in. It's a very volatile, dangerous moment. And one of the ways we de-escalate is we have people of goodwill step up and say, that is not who we're going to be as a people, and start to shrink those numbers who think that violence is an option.
It's really amazing. And we're getting close to time, and I would be remiss if I didn't at least kind of put you on the spot a little bit to challenge you about what you predict or the outcome or the evolution growth of Christian extremism if we had another Trump term. So I'd love to get your quick elevator pitch on that. Like, scare me to death, please.
Scare you to death. A second Trump term, there will be no guardrails. There will be no adults in the room. So you will see it manifest differently depending on the policy space. So in the national security space, for example, is where I would have the most concerns. He's been pretty clear that he wants to withdraw from NATO. He doesn't see a need to support Ukraine. And the cascading effects of that are a Russia who is likely to be empowered to invade parts of Eastern Europe, and we're quickly into a World War III type scenario. Similarly with China and Taiwan, once you have that domino fall, I think China is emboldened. North Korea is a wild card, like where you can apply some rationale to Russia and Iran and China. North Korea, not so much. You've got a madman there who has nuclear weapons and trying to get missile capability to be able to strike United States territory. So we live in a volatile world, and the people that he would put in charge of the intelligence community and the defense community would likely cause a lot of damage. You'd end up with a lot of civil servants that would just quit because they wouldn't execute what they perceive to be constitutional.
Yeah. And anyone to like overhaul that whole Schedule F, like,
yes,
thing. Mm-hmm.
And then on the domestic side, like the crux of your question was Christian extremism. I do think there are people. I don't think Trump himself cares. I think that he will install people who have a Christian nationalist agenda, and so they will attempt through either policy making, rulemaking, or through Congress, depending on how the House and the Senate, who gets to lead the House and the Senate, they will definitely try to pass things that become more legitimate Christian nationalist, and at least try to favor Christians, maybe not suppress other beliefs, but things will get tied up in courts. It's, I do think the guardrails of the courts matter, but that whole effort, he's planning on pardoning the January 6th cadre. You're going to end up with people regrouping. I don't know that leads to attacks on government. I think it will go back to what we were seeing before, of more the white power lone gunman type of attacks on marginalized parts of society.
Wow. Yeah. And that whole Project 2025 is kind of like a big Christian nationalism manifesto, so to speak. But okay, last 30 seconds. Where can people get your book? How can people stay in contact with what you're doing?
Thanks for asking. It is available on wherever you get your books. So Amazon, Target, Walmart, Barnes & Noble, all local bookstores. I found him in a couple of local Washington, D.C. bookstores last weekend, which was quite fun to see it in the wild. And I'm at elizabethneumann.org. I will be doing speaking and some public events over the coming months, and I am really most interested in trying to talk to the Christian community. So if you have a church group or a conference where I could speak with fellow believers about this, I would love that opportunity to engage in the conversation.
Awesome. Well, that's really good. Well, thank you so much, Elizabeth, for joining us.
Yes, thank you.
I think this has
fascinating.
Been really, really fascinating.
Fascinating, sobering, all of it.
Yeah, and thank you for being a faithful listener too. Can't let that one pass. So, well, anyways, to our listeners, our watchers, hey, thanks so much for joining us. This is Elizabeth Neumann. Her book is Kingdom of Rage: Rise of Christian Extremism and the Path Back to Peace. And this is Faithful Politics, and we'll see you next week. Take care.